Alright, YouTube, at least a dozen people have already left comments across my videos and messages speaking of the Austrian election. Of course, that was between Norbert Hofer, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, and Van der Bellen of the Green Party. Essentially, it's an interplay between someone who's kind of a nationalist. He's billed as far right, but I mean, you look at the fucking party platform, it's not like the Teutonic Nazi Party of its founding days. It's more of a center-right party that just happens to fixate on, yeah, we want borders to actually function. And then the Green Party candidate, who billed as far left, although, again, the Green Party's like maybe more environmentally and fiscally left, and on social issues, may a little bit more balanced than some of the weird multicultural regressive parties across Europe. And of course, last night, I have been paying attention to it. Don't think that me not making a video on it means I wasn't. Last night it was like 50-50. They were almost completely tied between the two of them. And then the postal votes came in. They favored the Green Party, and so Hofer lost. So you now have a leftist politician running Austria, as opposed to one that's called, again, you know, not is, but is called far right. My advice to the Austrians as well, if you don't like what your Green Party president does, campaign harder to get him out next time. Quite clearly, the state of Austria, the people there have spoken. If they want to go down the route of leftism, let them do so. Just because people didn't like the result doesn't mean they should whine and cry and scream bloody murder about rigging or something like that. Now, what are my thoughts on it? Yeah, I think Austria could do with a little bit of nationalism light, because quite clearly the border crisis in Europe necessitates that countries move more towards guarding their own cultures, because otherwise their cultures will be wiped off the face of the earth. Let's face it. Let's stop mincing words and pretending that it's not already happening in urban areas. You look at London, it's now London-stan. You look at Sweden, the entire nation's basically Sweden-stan. Stockholm is completely overrun. And that's not to say that foreigners should be completely unwelcome in these states, but my goodness, the level of immigration is untenable. I don't think that the so-called far right of Europe is even making an argument that there should be zero migration and we're kicking everybody out and gas the Jews sort of stuff. I think the argument that's being made is the economies and the cultures of Europe are not capable of maintaining the level of immigration. They're not capable of assimilating the number of immigrants, and that border control, at the very least Europe-wide, to keep out people that may be jihadists or something, is actually necessary. Now, I fail to see how that fundamental argument is far right. Because to me, it seems like something that would just be sort of taken for granted, like anybody who's not a complete lunatic would understand that concept. I'm not anti-immigrant here in the United States. I've already said that the act back in the 1980s under Reagan, which he signed, would have been perfect. It actually gave amnesty to 3 million people, but that would have been perfect if a border wall had been constructed and the border control had been given the funding and the things that it needed, the manpower needed and the time needed to actually defend the border. We could have done away with our own immigration issue back in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. It would have been great. Unfortunately, Mazzoli fell through. It didn't get passed in full. That is, it was essentially the Stimson-Mazzoli Act minus the border wall, which got like half built and was just a raggedy-ass fence with some berms here and there, and that's all our border wall is at this point, let's face it. And the problem is then people kept immigrating illegally. And the funnier part was all the nativists keep saying, oh, these illegal Mexicans, and half of them aren't even from Mexico. They're like Guatemalans and Hondurans and from El Salvador and places like that, or they're Panamanians or something. They can't even tell the difference between these groups of people, which is rather funny. But I don't consider it far right to suggest that a nation has the fundamental right to safeguard its borders and determine who does and does not enter the country. I don't see that as a problem. Even as a libertarian, some, like the Gary Johnson libertarians, the one thing I have issue with them on is they believe in opening the borders up. I don't think a libertarian society can sustain that, because the problem that you can have is what if 100 million Chinese communists decide to settle in and start a communist party that ends up winning the next election? Well, you've just destroyed libertarianism in a single election cycle. It may sound like a dubious thing. It may sound like, oh, that never happened. That's like spy versus spy nonsense. Yeah, it could. Yeah, absolutely. The head of ISIS routinely talks and laughs about the fact that he's going to overthrow some of these European states by attacking them constantly and driving away the native population to establish Sharia law. Now, while this may or may not actually happen, it's certainly progressing in that direction because nobody has taken the steps necessary to stop it. That's the problem. I don't think that even most of the self-proclaimed nationalists in Europe, like the Sons of Odin sort of people, I don't think they have a problem with immigration per se. I think they have more of a problem with two things. Number one, it's uncontrolled. That is, nobody's even sure how many people are coming in. Number two, where in the world they're from and what some of them believe in, which is specifically, we want Islamic law, we want Islamic culture, we're going to establish a no-go sort of Sharia zone or something like you'd see in London or Paris or Berlin or something like that. I think that's what they have issue with. The funny thing is, the governments of Europe with their multiculturalism don't even understand this, but they themselves are giving rise to the seeds of nationalism and populism all over Europe. Specifically, there were no such movements before the social alienation of mass immigration began. If it had never begun, if borders had continued to be somewhat controlled, the situation was kept to a slow simmering roil, and things were generally seen as okay. The economy could support the migrants, and they were screening the refugees properly, and the borders weren't being physically continuously overrun with riots breaking out anytime a fence is erected, you wouldn't see the rise of this so-called far right everyone in Europe is so worried about. It wouldn't be there. It would still be, they'd be pulling in like 1-2% of the vote in these states. Instead, you have a man who's supposedly very far right and part of a former Nazi party, getting almost 50% of the votes in the Austrian election, you know, the sort of Hitler homeland country. Well, I would think that this would be an indicator that the EU's not working, the open border system's not working, and the situation with the number of migrants coming in, specifically the type of migrants coming in, is a problem. And even funnier, this is the one thing I have that I don't quite understand about somebody like Nigel Farage. I support the Brexit. I think UKIP has common sense. He seems to be more worried about like Polish workers coming in than people from Pakistan and Somalia. I don't quite understand that. I'd think you'd want like fellow Europeans to move in, people who practice the same religion and have kind of the same culture, at least an overarching like pseudo-culture, like EU-style culture, as opposed to people from a totally different continent that have never like even been to your country before and they're not anywhere near you. They're not used to the climate, they're not used to the culture, they don't have what you would consider secular values necessarily. As for refugees, that's just fine. The problem is the governments of Europe have taken in 3 or 4 economic migrants for every Syrian refugee that's entering these countries. That's why there's social alienation. That's why Hofer almost won. And the next time around, if the problem is not solved, I assure you, the next time the election rolls around, it won't be the Green Party winning. It'll probably be somebody who will make Hofer look like a leftist. That's what I can promise you. You see this. It's growing all over Europe, in Denmark, in France, in Germany, everywhere. All of the so-called right-wing parties, which are really just populists, are in growth. Most of the leftist movements, other than like, you know, fringe, like Green Party, Communist Party, are in decline. The centrist parties, so-called, of Europe that represent the political establishment of the EU and friendliness towards its goals are dying off. The fringe is growing. Whether it's far left or far right, it really doesn't matter. We saw this in the 30s. It got to the point where it wasn't so much about the Republicans and the Social Democrats and these nice, safe establishment parties in Weimar Germany. Who was it primarily vying in the streets? It was communists on the one hand and National Socialists on the other. To the point at which everybody else like threw up their hands, are like, fuck this, we can't deal with this bullshit, and a lot of them just fled. So that's what's happening in Europe today. Now, do I expect like violence in the streets, sort of like gassing and purges and people taking up arms? Probably not. Hopefully the situation can get sorted out without like interwar period stupidity strangulating any effort to do so. But when I see an almost 50-50 split between someone who, according to European standards, not mine, but European standards, is really far right and a kind of a Nazi, and somebody who represents the Green Party of all parties, That's the point at which it begins to look a lot like Germany did in the 1930s. So yeah, Hofer lost, but it doesn't really matter. It didn't matter who won this election. It was so close. It shows the split, the partisanship within the population. That's about all.